My first experience of jail life was in 1908. I saw that some of the regulations that the prisoners had to observe were such as should be voluntarily observed by a brahmachari, that is, one desiring to practice self-restraint. Such, for instance, was the regulation requiring the last meal to be finished before sunset. Neither the Indian nor the African prisoners were allowed tea or coffee. They could add salt to the cooked food if they wished, but they might not have anything for the mere satisfaction of the palate. When I asked the jail medical officer to give us curry powder and to let us add salt to the food whilst it was cooking, he said, "You are not here for satisfying your palate. From the point of view of your health, curry powder is not necessary, and it makes no difference whether you add salt during or after cooking." Ultimately, these restrictions were modified, though not without much difficulty, but both were wholesome rules of self-restraint. Inhibitions imposed from without rarely succeed, but when they are self-imposed, they have a decidedly salutary effect. So, immediately after release from jail, I imposed on myself the two rules. As far as was then possible, I stopped taking tea and finished my last meal before sunset. Both these now require no effect in the observance. Then came, however, an occasion which compelled me to give up salt altogether, and this restriction I continued for an unbroken period of 10 years. I had read in some books on vegetarianism that salt was not a necessary article of diet for man, that on the contrary, saltless diet was better for the health. I had deduced that a brahmachari benefited by a saltless diet. I had read and realized that the weak-bodied should avoid pulses. I was very fond of them. Now it happened that Kasturbai, who had a brief respite after her operation, had again begun getting hemorrhage, and the malady seemed to be obstinate. Hydropathic treatment by itself did not answer. She had not much faith in my remedies, though she did not resist them. She certainly did not ask for outside help. So when all my remedies had failed, I entreated her to give up salt and pulses. She would not agree, however much I pleaded with her, supporting myself with authorities. At last she challenged me, saying that even I could not give up these articles if I was advised to do so. I was pained and equally delighted in that I got an opportunity to shower my love on her. I said to her, "You are mistaken. If I was ailing and the doctor advised me to give up these or any other articles, I should unhesitatingly do so. But there, without any medical advice, I give up salt and pulses for 1 year, whether you do so or not." She was rudely shocked and exclaimed in deep sorrow, "Pray forgive me, knowing you, I should not have provoked you. I promise to abstain from these things, but for heaven's sake, take back your vow. This is too hard on me." "It is very good for you to forego these articles. I have not the slightest doubt that you will be all the better without them. As for me, I cannot retract a vow seriously taken, and it is sure to benefit me, for all restraint, whatever prompts it, is wholesome for men. You will therefore leave me alone. It will be a test for me, and a moral support to you in carrying out your resolve." So she gave me up. "You are too obstinate, you will listen to none," she said, and sought relief in tears. I would like to count this incident as an instance of a Satyagraha, and it is one of the sweetest recollections of my life. After this, Kasturbai began to pick up quickly, whether as a result of the saltless and pulseless diet or of the other consequent changes in her food, whether as a result of my strict vigilance in exacting observance of the other rules of life, or as an effect of the mental exhilaration produced by the incident, and if so, to what extent I cannot say. But she rallied quickly. Hemorrhage completely stopped, and I added somewhat to my reputation as a quack. As for me, I was all the better for the new denials. I never craved for the things I had left. The years sped away, and I found the senses to be more subdued than ever. The experiment stimulated the inclination for self-restraint, and I returned to India. Only once I happened to take both the articles whilst I was in London in 1914. But of that occasion and as to how I resumed both, I shall speak in a later chapter. I have tried the experiment of a saltless and pulseless diet on many of my co-workers, and with good results in South Africa. Medically, there may be two opinions as to the value of this diet, but morally I have no doubt that all self-denial is good for the soul. The diet of a man of self-restraint must be different from that of a man of pleasure, just as their ways of life must be different. Aspirants after brahmacharya often defeat their own end by adopting courses suited to a life of pleasure. I have described in the last chapter how Kasturbai's illness was instrumental in bringing about some changes in my diet. At a later stage, more changes were introduced for the sake of supporting brahmacharya. The first of these was the giving up of milk. It was from Rechand Bhai that I first learnt that milk stimulated animal passion. Books on vegetarianism strengthened the idea, but so long as I had not taken the brahmacharya vow, I could not make up my mind to forego milk. I had long realized that milk was not necessary for supporting the body, but it was not easy to give it up. While the necessity for avoiding milk in the interests of self-restraint was growing upon me, I happened to come across some literature from Calcutta describing the tortures to which cows and buffaloes were subjected by their keepers. This had a wonderful effect on me. I discussed it with Mr. Kallenbach. Though I have introduced Mr. Kallenbach to the readers of the history of Satyagraha in South Africa and referred to him in a previous chapter, I think it necessary to say something more about him here. We met quite by accident. He was a friend of Mr. Khan's, and as the latter had discovered deep down in him a vein of otherworldliness, he introduced him to me. When I came to know him, I was startled at his love of luxury and extravagance. But at our very first meeting, he asked searching questions concerning matters of religion. We incidentally talked of Gautam Buddha's renunciation. Our acquaintance soon ripened into very close friendship, so much so that we thought alike, and he was convinced that he must carry out in his life the changes I was making in mine. At the time he was single and was expending rupees 1200 monthly on himself, over and above house rent. Now he reduced himself to such simplicity that his expenses came to rupees 120 per month. After the breaking up of my household and my first release from jail, we began to live together. It was a fairly hard life that we led. It was during this time that we had the discussion about milk. Mr. Kallenbach said, "We constantly talk about the harmful effects of milk. Why then do not we give it up? It is certainly not necessary." I was agreeably surprised at the suggestion, which I warmly welcomed, and both of us pledged ourselves to abjure milk there and then. This was at Tolstoy Farm in the year 1912. But this denial was not enough to satisfy me. Soon after this, I decided to live on a pure fruit diet, and that too composed of the cheapest fruit possible. Our ambition was to live the life of the poorest people. The fruit diet turned out to be very convenient also. Cooking was practically done away with. Raw groundnuts, bananas, dates, lemons, and olive oil composed our usual diet. I must here utter a warning for the aspirants of brahmacharya. I must here utter a warning for the aspirants of Brahmacharya. Though I have made out an intimate connection between diet and Brahmacharya, it is certain that mind is the principal thing. A mind consciously unclean cannot be cleansed by fasting. Modifications in diet have no effect on it. The concupiscence of the mind cannot be rooted out except by intense self-examination, surrender to God, and lastly, grace. But there is an intimate connection between the mind and the body, and the carnal mind always lusts for delicacies and luxuries. To obviate this tendency, dietetic restrictions and fasting would appear to be necessary. The carnal mind, instead of controlling the senses, becomes their slave, and therefore the body always needs clean, non-stimulating foods and periodical fasting. Those who make light of dietetic restrictions and fasting are as much in error as those who stake their all on them. My experience teaches me that for those whose minds are working towards self-restraint, dietetic restrictions and fasting are very helpful. In fact, without their help, concupiscence cannot be completely rooted out of the mind. Just about the time when I gave up milk and cereals and started on the experiment of a fruit diet, I commenced fasting as a means of self-restraint. In this, Mr. Kallenbach also joined me. I had been used to fasting now and again, but for purely health reasons. That fasting was necessary for self-restraint, I learnt from a friend. Having been born in a Vaishnava family and of a mother who was given to keeping all sorts of hard vows, I had observed, while in India, the Ekadashi and other fasts, but in doing so, I had merely copied my mother and sought to please my parents. At that time, I did not understand nor did I believe in the efficacy of fasting. But seeing that the friend I have mentioned was observing it with benefit and with the hope of supporting the Brahmacharya vow, I followed his example and began keeping the Ekadashi fast. As a rule, Hindus allow themselves milk and fruit on a fasting day, but such fast I had been keeping daily. So now I began complete fasting, allowing myself only water. When I started on this experiment, the Hindu month of Shravan and the Islamic month of Ramazan happened to coincide. The Gandhis used to observe not only the Vaishnava but also the Shaivite vows and visited the Shaivite as also the Vaishnava temples. Some of the members of the family used to observe Pradosha in the whole of the month of Shravana. I decided to do likewise. These important experiments were undertaken while we were at Tolstoy farm, where Mr. Kallenbach and I were staying with a few Satyagrahi families, including young people and children. For these last we had a school. Among them were 4 or 5 Mussalmans. I always helped and encouraged them in keeping all their religious observances. I took care to see that they offered their daily namaz. There were Christians and Parsi youngsters too, whom I considered it my duty to encourage to follow their respective religious observances. During this month, therefore, I persuaded the Mussalman youngsters to observe the Ramzan fast. I had of course decided to observe Pradosha myself, but I now asked the Hindu, Parsi and Christian youngsters to join me. I explained to them that it was always a good thing to join with others in any matter of self-denial. Many of the farm inmates welcomed my proposal. The Hindu and the Parsi youngsters did not copy the Mussalman ones in every detail. It was not necessary. The Mussalman youngsters had to wait for their breakfast until sunset, whereas the others did not do so, and were thus able to prepare delicacies for the Mussalman friends and serve them. Nor had the Hindu and other youngsters to keep the Mussalmans company when they had their last meal before sunrise next morning, and of course all except the Mussalmans allowed themselves water. The result of these experiments was that all were convinced of the value of fasting, and a splendid esprit de corps grew up among them. We were all vegetarians on Tolstoy farm, thanks, I must gratefully confess, to the readiness of all to respect my feelings. The Musalman youngsters must have missed their mate during Ramzan, but none of them ever let me know that they did so. They delighted in and relished the vegetarian diet, and the Hindu youngsters often prepared vegetarian delicacies for them in keeping with the simplicity of the farm. I have purposely digressed in the midst of this chapter on fasting, as I could not have given these pleasant reminiscences anywhere else, and I have indirectly described a characteristic of mine, namely that I have always loved to have my co-workers with me in anything that has appealed to me as being good. They were quite new to fasting, but thanks to the Pradosha and Ramzan fasts, it was easy for me to interest them in fasting as a means of self-restraint. Thus an atmosphere of self-restraint naturally sprang up on the farm. All the farm inmates now began to join us in keeping partial and complete fasts, which I am sure was entirely to the good. I cannot definitely say how far this self-denial touched their hearts and helped them in their striving to conquer the flesh. For my part, however, I am convinced that I greatly benefited by it both physically and morally. But I know that it does not necessarily follow that fasting and similar disciplines would have the same effect for all. Fasting can help to curb animal passion only if it is undertaken with a view to self-restraint. Some of my friends have actually found their animal passion and palate stimulated as an after effect of fasts. That is to say, fasting is futile unless it is accompanied by an incessant longing for self-restraint. The famous verse from the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita is worth noting in this connection. For a man who is fasting his senses outwardly, the sense objects disappear, leaving the yearning behind. But when he has seen the highest, even the yearning disappears. Fasting and similar discipline is, therefore, one of the means to the end of self-restraint. But it is not all, and if physical fasting is not accompanied by mental fasting, it is bound to end in hypocrisy and disaster. The reader will, I hope, bear in mind the fact that I am, in these chapters, describing things not mentioned or only cursorily mentioned in the history of a Satyagraha in South Africa. If he does so, he will easily see the connection between the recent chapters. As the farm grew, it was found necessary to make some provision for the education of its boys and girls. There were among these Hindu, Musalman, Parsi and Christian boys and some Hindu girls. It was not possible, and I did not think it necessary, to engage special teachers for them. It was not possible, for qualified Indian teachers were scarce, and even when available, none would be ready to go to a place 21 miles distant from Johannesburg on a small salary. Also, we were certainly not overflowing with money, and I did not think it necessary to import teachers from outside the farm. I did not believe in the existing system of education, and I had a mind to find out by experience and experiment the true system. Only this much I knew, that under ideal conditions, true education could be imparted only by the parents, and that then there should be the minimum of outside help, that a Tolstoy farm was a family in which I occupied the place of the father, and that I should so far as possible shoulder the responsibility for the training of the young. The conception, no doubt, was not without its flaws. All the young people had not been with me since their childhood. They had been brought up in different conditions and environments, and they did not belong to the same religion. How could I do full justice to the young people thus circumstanced, even if I assumed the place of paterfamilias? But I had always given the first place to the culture of the heart or the building of character, and as I felt confident that moral training could be given to all alike, no matter how different their ages and their upbringing, I decided to live amongst them all the 24 hours of the day as their father. I regarded character building as the proper foundation for their education, and if the foundation was firmly laid, I was sure that the children could learn all the other things themselves or with the assistance of friends. But as I fully appreciated the necessity of a literary training, in addition, I started some classes with the help of Mr. Kallenbach and Sergeant Pragji Desai. Nor did I underrate the building up of the body. This they got in the course of their daily routine. For there were no servants on the farm, and all the work from cooking down to scavenging was done by the inmates. There were many fruit trees to be looked after and enough gardening to be done as well. Mr. Kallenbach was fond of gardening and had gained some experience of this work in one of the governmental model gardens. It was obligatory on all, young and old, who were not engaged in the kitchen to give some time to gardening. The children had the lion's share of this work, which included digging pits, felling timber and lifting loads. This gave them ample exercise. They took delight in the work, and so they did not generally need any other exercise or games. Of course, some of them, and sometimes all of them, malingered and shirked. Sometimes I connived at their pranks, but often I was strict with them. I dare say they did not like the strictness, but I do not recollect their having resisted it. Whenever I was strict, I would, by argument, convince them that it was not right to play with one's work. The conviction would, however, be short-lived. The next moment, they would again leave their work and go to play. All the same, we got along, and at any rate, they built up fine physiques. There was scarcely any illness on the farm, though it must be said that good air and water and regular hours of food were not a little responsible for this. A word about vocational training. It was my intention to teach every one of the youngsters some useful manual vocation. For this purpose, Mr. Kallenbach went to a Trappist monastery and returned having learnt shoemaking. I learnt it from him and taught the art to such as were ready to take it up. Mr. Kallenbach had some experience of carpentry, and there was another inmate who knew it. So we had a small class in carpentry. Cooking almost all the youngsters knew. All this was new to them. They had never even dreamt that they would have to learn these things some day. For generally the only training that Indian children received in South Africa was in the arts. On Tolstoy farm, we made it a rule that the youngsters should not be asked to do what the teachers did not do, and therefore, when they were asked to do any work, there was always a teacher cooperating and actually working with them. Hence, whatever the youngsters learnt, they learnt cheerfully. Literary training and character building must be dealt with in the following chapters. It was seen in the last chapter how we provided for the physical training on Tolstoy farm and incidentally for the vocational. Though this was hardly done in a way to satisfy me, it may be claimed to have been more or less successful. Literary training, however, was a more difficult matter. I had neither the resources nor the literary equipment necessary, and I had not the time I would have wished to devote to the subject. The physical work that I was doing used to leave me thoroughly exhausted at the end of the day, and I used to have the classes just when I was most in need of some rest. Instead, therefore, of my being fresh for the class, I could with the greatest difficulty keep myself awake. The mornings had to be devoted to work on the farm and domestic duties, so the school hours had to be kept after the midday meal. There was no other time suitable for the school. We gave 3 periods at the most to literary training. Hindi, Tamil, Gujarati and Urdu were all taught, and tuition was given through the vernaculars of the boys. English was taught as well. It was also necessary to acquaint the Gujarati Hindu children with a little Sanskrit, and to teach all the children elementary history, geography and arithmetic. I had undertaken to teach Tamil and Urdu. The little Tamil I knew was acquired during voyages and in jail. I had not got beyond Pope's excellent Tamil handbook. My knowledge of the Urdu script was all that I had acquired on a single voyage, and my knowledge of the language was confined to the familiar Persian and Arabic words that I had learnt from contact with Mussalman friends. Of Sanskrit I knew no more than I had learnt at the high school. Even my Gujarati was no better than that which one acquires at the school. Such was the capital with which I had to carry on. In poverty of literary equipment, my colleagues went one better than I. But my love for the languages of my country, my confidence in my pupils, and more than that, their generosity stood me in good stead. The Tamil boys were all born in South Africa and therefore knew very little Tamil and did not know the script at all. So I had to teach them the script and the rudiments of grammar. That was easy enough. My pupils knew that they could any day beat me in Tamil conversation, and when Tamilians not knowing English came to see me, they became my interpreters. I got along merrily because I never attempted to disguise my ignorance from my pupils. In all respects, I showed myself to them exactly as I really was. Therefore, in spite of my colossal ignorance of the language, I never lost their love and respect. It was comparatively easier to teach the Mussalman boys Urdu. They knew the script. I had simply to stimulate in them an interest in reading and to improve their handwriting. These youngsters were for the most part unlettered and unschooled, but I found in the course of my work that I had very little to teach them beyond weaning them from their laziness and supervising their studies. As I was content with this, I could pull on with boys of different ages and learning different subjects in one and the same classroom. Of textbooks about which we hear so much, I never felt the want. I do not even remember having made much use of the books that were available. I did not find it at all necessary to load the boys with quantities of books. I have always felt that the true textbook for the pupil is his teacher. I remember very little that my teachers taught me from books, but I have even now a clear recollection of the things they taught me independently of books. Children take in much more and with less labor through their ears than through their eyes. I do not remember having read any book from cover to cover with my boys, but I gave them, in my own language, all that I had digested from my reading of various books, and I dare say they are still carrying a recollection of it in their minds. It was laborious for them to remember what they learnt from books, but what I imparted to them by word of mouth they could repeat with the greatest ease. Reading was a task for them, but listening to me was a pleasure, when I did not bore them by failure to make my subject interesting. And from the questions that my talks prompted them to put, I had a measure of their power of understanding. The spiritual training of the boys was a much more difficult matter than their physical and mental training. I relied little on religious books for the training of the spirit. Of course, I believed that every student should be acquainted with the elements of his own religion and have a general knowledge of his own scriptures, and therefore I provided for such knowledge as best as I could. But that, to my mind, was a part of the intellectual training. Long before I undertook the education of the youngsters of the Tolstoy form, I had realized that the training of the spirit was a thing by itself. To develop the spirit is to build character and to enable one to work towards a knowledge of God and self-realization. And I held that this was an essential part of the training of the young, and that all training without culture of the spirit was of no use and might be even harmful. I am familiar with the superstition that self-realization is possible only in the fourth stage of life, that is, sannyasa, renunciation. But it is a matter of common knowledge that those who defer preparation for this invaluable experience until the last stage of life attain not self-realization but old age, amounting to a second and pitiable childhood, living as a burden on this earth. I have a full recollection that I held these views even whilst I was teaching, that is, in 1911 and 12, though I might not then have expressed them in identical language. How then was this spiritual training to be given? I made the children memorize and recite hymns and read to them from books on moral training. But that was far from satisfying me. As I came into closer contact with them, I saw that it was not through books that one could impart training of the spirit. Just as physical training was to be imparted through physical exercise, even so the training of the spirit was possible only through the exercise of the spirit. And the exercise of the spirit entirely depended on the life and character of the teacher. The teacher had always to be mindful of his P's and Q's, whether he was in the midst of his boys or not. It is possible for a teacher, situated miles away, to affect the spirit of the pupils by his way of living. It could be idle for me, if I were a liar, to teach boys to tell the truth. A cowardly teacher would never succeed in making his boys valiant, and a stranger to self-restraint could never teach his pupils the value of self-restraint. I saw, therefore, that I must be an eternal object lesson to the boys and girls living with me. They thus became my teachers, and I learnt I must be good and live straight, if only for their sakes. I may say that the increasing discipline and restraint I imposed on myself at Tolstoy farm was mostly due to those wards of mine. One of them was wild, unruly, given to lying and quarrelsome. On one occasion he broke out most violently. I was exasperated. I never punished my boys, but this time I was very angry. I tried to reason with him, but he was adamant and even tried to overreach me. At last I picked up a ruler lying at hand and delivered a blow on his arm. I trembled as I struck him. I dare say he noticed it. This was an entirely novel experience for them all. The boy cried out and begged to be forgiven. He cried not because the beating was painful to him. He could, if he had been so minded, have paid me back in the same coin, being a stoutly built youth of 17. But he realized my pain in being driven to this violent recourse. Never again after this incident did he disobey me, but I still repent that violence. I am afraid I exhibited before him that day not the spirit but the brute in me. I have always been opposed to corporal punishment. I remember only one occasion on which I physically punished one of my sons. I have therefore never until this day been able to decide whether I was right or wrong in using the ruler. Probably it was improper, for it was prompted by anger and a desire to punish. Had it been an expression only of my distress, I should have considered it justified. but the motive in this case was mixed. This incident set me thinking and taught me a better method of correcting students. I do not know whether that method would have availed on the occasion in question. The youngster soon forgot the incident, and I do not think he ever showed great improvement. But the incident made me understand better the duty of a teacher towards his pupils. Cases of misconduct on the part of the boys often occurred after this, but I never resorted to corporal punishment. Thus, in my endeavor to impart spiritual training to the boys and girls under me, I came to understand better and better the power of spirit. It was at Tolstoy Farm that Mr. Kallenbach drew my attention to a problem that had never before struck me. As I have already said, some of the boys at the farm were bad and unruly. There were loafers too amongst them. With these, my 3 boys came in daily contact, as also did other children of the same type as my own sons. This troubled Mr. Kallenbach, but his attention was centered on the impropriety of keeping my boys with these unruly youngsters. One day he spoke out. "Your way of mixing your own boys with the bad ones does not appeal to me. It can have only one result. They will become demoralized through this bad company." I do not remember whether the question puzzled me at the moment, but I recollect what I said to him. "How can I distinguish between my boys and the loafers? I am equally responsible for both. The youngsters have come because I invited them. If I were to dismiss them with some money, they would immediately run off to Johannesburg and fall back into their own ways. To tell you the truth, it is quite likely that they and their guardians believe that by having come here they have laid me under an obligation. That they have to put up with a good deal of inconvenience here, you and I know very well, but my duty is clear. I must have them here, and therefore my boys also must needs live with them. And surely you do not want me to teach my boys to feel from today that they are superior to other boys. To put that sense of superiority into their heads would be to lead them astray. This association with other boys will be a good discipline for them. They will, of their own accord, learn to discriminate between good and evil. Why should we not believe that if there is really anything good in them, it is bound to react on their companions? However that may be, I cannot help keeping them here, and if that means some risk, we must run it." Mr. Kallenbach shook his head. "The result, I think, cannot be said to have been bad. I do not consider my sons were any worse for the experiment. On the contrary, I can see that they gained something. If there was the slightest trace of superiority in them, it was destroyed, and they learnt to mix with all kinds of children. They were tested and disciplined. This and similar experiments have shown me that if good children are taught together with bad ones and thrown into their company, they will lose nothing provided the experiment is conducted under the watchful care of their parents and guardians. Children wrapped up in cotton wool are not always proof against all temptation or contamination. It is true, however, that when boys and girls of all kinds of upbringing are kept and taught together, the parents and the teachers are put to the severest test. They have constantly to be on the alert. Day by day it became increasingly clear to me how very difficult it was to bring up and educate boys and girls in the right way. If I was to be their real teacher and guardian, I must touch their hearts. I must share their joys and sorrows. I must help them to solve the problems that faced them, and I must take along the right channel the surging aspirations of their youth. On the release of some of the Satyagrahis from jail, Tolstoy farm was almost denuded of its inmates. The few that remained mostly belonged to Phoenix. So I removed them there. Here I had to pass through a fiery ordeal. In those days I had to move between Johannesburg and Phoenix. Once when I was in Johannesburg, I received tidings of the moral fall of two of the inmates of the ashram. News of an apparent failure or reverse in the Satyagraha struggle would not have shocked me, but this news came upon me like a thunderbolt. The same day I took the train for Phoenix. Mr. Kallenbach insisted on accompanying me. He had noticed the state I was in. He would not brook the thought of my going alone, for he happened to be the bearer of the tidings which had so upset me. During the journey my duty seemed clear to me. I felt that the guardian or teacher was responsible, to some extent at least, for the lapse of his ward or pupil. So my responsibility regarding the incident in question became clear to me as daylight. My wife had already warned me in the matter, but being of a trusting nature, I had ignored her caution. I felt that the only way the guilty parties could be made to realize my distress and the depth of their own fall would be for me to do some penance. So I imposed upon myself a fast for 7 days and a vow to have only 1 meal a day for a period of 4 months and a half. Mr. Kallenbach tried to dissuade me, but in vain. He finally considered the propriety of the penance and insisted on joining me. I could not resist his transparent affection. I felt greatly relieved, for the decision meant a heavy load off my mind. The anger against the guilty parties subsided and gave place to the purest pity for them. Thus considerably eased, I reached Phoenix. I made further investigation and acquainted myself with some more details I needed to know. My penance pained everybody, but it cleared the atmosphere. Everyone came to realize what a terrible thing it was to be sinful, and the bond that bound me to the boys and girls became stronger and truer. A circumstance arising out of this incident compelled me, a little while after, to go into a fast for 14 days, the results of which exceeded even my expectations. It is not my purpose to make out from these incidents that it is the duty of a teacher to resort to fasting whenever there is a delinquency on the part of the pupils. I hold, however, that some occasions do call for this drastic remedy, but it presupposes clearness of vision and spiritual fitness. Where there is no true love between the teacher and the pupil, where the pupil's delinquency has not touched the very being of the teacher, and where the pupil has no respect for the teacher, fasting is out of place and may even be harmful. Though there is thus room for doubting the propriety of fasts in such cases, there is no question about the teacher's responsibility for the errors of his pupil. The first penance did not prove difficult for any of us. I had to suspend or stop none of my normal activities. It may be recalled that during the whole of this period of penance, I was a strict fruitarian. The latter part of the second fast went fairly hard with me. I had not then completely understood the wonderful efficacy of Ramanama, and my capacity for suffering was to that extent less. Besides, I did not know the technique of fasting, especially the necessity of drinking plenty of water, however nauseating or distasteful it might be. Then the fact that the first fast had been an easy affair made me rather careless as to the second. Thus, during the first I took kuhne baths every day, but during the second I gave up after 2 or 3 days and drank very little water, as it was distasteful and produced nausea. The throat became parched and weak, and during the last days I could speak only in a very low voice. In spite of this, however, my work was carried on through dictation where writing was necessary. I regularly listened to readings from the Ramayana and other sacred books. I had also sufficient strength to discuss and advise in all urgent matters. I must skip many of the recollections of South Africa. At the conclusion of the Satyagraha struggle in 1914, I received Gokhale's instruction to return home via London. So, in July, Kasturbai, Kallenbach and I sailed for England. During Satyagraha, I had begun travelling third class. I therefore took third class passages for this voyage. But there was a good deal of difference between third class accommodation on the boat on this route and that provided on Indian coastal boats or railway trains. There is hardly sufficient sitting, much less sleeping, accommodation in the Indian service and little cleanliness. During the voyage to London, on the other hand, there was enough room and cleanliness, and the steamship company had provided special facilities for us. The company had provided reserved closet accommodation for us, and as we were fruitarians, the steward had orders to supply us with fruits and nuts. As a rule, third-class passengers get little fruit or nuts. These facilities made our 18 days on the boat quite comfortable. Some of the incidents during the voyage are well worth recording. Mr. Kallenbach was very fond of binoculars and had one or two costly pairs. We had daily discussion over one of these. I tried to impress on him that this possession was not in keeping with the ideal of simplicity that we aspired to reach. Our discussions came to a head one day as we were standing near the porthole of our cabin. Rather than allow these to be a bone of contention between us, why not throw them into the sea and be done with them? Said I. Certainly, throw the wretched things away, said Mr. Kallenbach. I mean it, said I. So do I, quickly came the reply. And forthwith I flung them into the sea. They were worth some 7 pounds, but their value lay less in their price than in Mr. Kallenbach's infatuation for them. However, having got rid of them, he never regretted it. This is one out of the many incidents that happened between Mr. Kallenbach and me. Every day we had to learn something new in this way, for both of us were trying to tread the path of truth. In the march towards truth, anger, selfishness, hatred, etc. naturally give way, for otherwise truth would be impossible to attain. A man who is swayed by passions may have good enough intentions, may be truthful in word, but he will never find the truth. A successful search for the truth means complete deliverance from the dual throng, such as of love and hate, happiness and misery. Not much time had elapsed since my fast when we started on our voyage. I had not regained my normal strength. I used to stroll on deck to get a little exercise so as to revive my appetite and digest what I ate. But even this exercise was beyond me, causing pain in the calves, so much so that on reaching London I found that I was worse rather than better. There I came to know Dr. Jeevaraj Mehta. I gave him the history of my fast and subsequent pain, and he said, "If you do not take complete rest for a few days, there is a fear of your legs going out of use." It was then that I learned that a man emerging from a long fast should not be in a hurry to regain lost strength, and should also put a curb on his appetite. More caution and perhaps more restraint are necessary in breaking a fast than in keeping it. In Madeira, we heard that the Great War might break out at any moment. As we entered the English Channel, we received the news of its actual outbreak. We were stopped for some time. It was a difficult business to tow the boat through the submarine mines, which had been laid throughout the channel, and it took about 2 days to reach Southampton. War was declared on the 4th of August. We reached London on the 6th. On arrival in England, I learned that Gokhale had been stranded in Paris, where he had gone for reasons of health, and as communication between Paris and London had been cut off, there was no knowing when he would return. I did not want to go home without having seen him, but no one could say definitely when he would arrive. What then was I to do in the meanwhile? What was my duty as regards the war? Sorabji Adajania, my comrade in jail and a Satyagrahi, was then reading for the bar in London. As one of the best Satyagrahis, he had been sent to England to qualify himself as a barrister so that he might take my place on return to South Africa. Dr. Pranjivandas Mehta was paying his expenses with him, and through him I had conferences with Dr. Jeevraj Mehta and others who were prosecuting their studies in England. In consultation with them, a meeting of the Indian residents in Great Britain and Ireland was called. I placed my views before him. I felt that Indians residing in England ought to do their bit in the war. English students had volunteered to serve in the army, and Indians might do no less. A number of objections were taken to this line of argument. It was contended, a world of difference between the Indians and the English. We were slaves, and they were masters. How could a slave cooperate with a master in the hour of the latter's need? Was it not the duty of the slave, seeking to be free, to make the master's need his opportunity? This argument failed to appeal to me then. I knew the difference of status between an Indian and an Englishman, but I did not believe that we had been quite reduced to slavery. I felt then that it was more the fault of individual British officials than of the British system, and that we could convert them by love. If we would improve our status through the help and cooperation of the British, it was our duty to win their help by standing by them in their hour of need. Though the system was faulty, it did not seem to me to be intolerable as it does today. But if, having lost my faith in the system, I refuse to cooperate with the British government today, how could those friends then do so, having lost their faith, and not only in the system but in the officials as well? The opposing friends felt that was the hour for making a bold declaration of Indian demands and for improving the status of Indians. I thought that England's need should not be turned into our opportunity, and that it was more becoming and far-sighted not to press our demands while the war lasted. I therefore adhered to my advice and invited those who would enlist as volunteers. There was a good response, practically all the provinces and all the religions being represented among the volunteers. I wrote a letter to Lord Crewe, acquainting him with these facts and expressing our readiness to be trained for ambulance work, if that should be considered a condition precedent to the acceptance of our offer. Lord Crewe accepted the offer after some hesitation and thanked us for having tendered our services to the Empire at that critical hour. The volunteers began their preliminary training in first aid to the wounded under the well-known Dr. Cantley. It was a short course of 6 weeks, but it covered the whole course of first aid. We were a class of about 80. In 6 weeks we were examined, and all except one passed. For these, the government now provided military drill and other training. Colonel Baker was placed in charge of this work. London in these days was a sight worth seeing. There was no panic, but all were busy helping to the best of their ability. Able-bodied adults began training as combatants, but what were the old, the infirm, and the women to do? There was enough work for them if they wanted, so they employed themselves in cutting and making clothes and dressings for the wounded. The Lyceum, a ladies' club, undertook to make as many clothes for the soldiers as they could. Srimati Sarojini Naidu was a member of this club and threw herself wholeheartedly into the work. This was my first acquaintance with her. She placed before me a heap of clothes which had been cut to pattern and asked me to get them all sewn up and return them to her. I welcomed her demand and with the assistance of friends got as many clothes made as I could manage during my training for first aid. As soon as the news reached South Africa that I, along with other Indians, had offered my services in the war, I received 2 cables. One of these was from Mr. Pollock, who questioned the consistency of my action with my profession of ahimsa. I had to a certain extent anticipated this objection, for I had discussed the question in my Hind Swaraj or Indian Home Rule and used to discuss it day in and day out with friends in South Africa. All of us recognized the immorality of war. If I was not prepared to prosecute my assailant, much less should I be willing to participate in a war, especially when I knew nothing of the justice or otherwise of the cause of the combatants. Friends, of course, knew that I had previously served in the Boer War, but they assumed that my views had since undergone a change. As a matter of fact, the very same line of argument that persuaded me to take part in the Boer War had weighed with me on this occasion. It was quite clear to me that participation in war could never be consistent with ahimsa. But it is not always given to one to be equally clear about one's duty. A votary of truth is often obliged to grope in the dark. Ahimsa is a comprehensive principle. We are helpless mortals caught in the conflagration of himsa. The saying that life lives on life has a deep meaning in it. Man cannot for a moment live without consciously or unconsciously committing outward himsa. The very fact of his living, eating, drinking and moving about necessarily involves some himsa, destruction of life, be it ever so minute. A votary of ahimsa therefore remains true to his faith if the spring of all his actions is compassion, if he shuns to the best of his ability the destruction of the tiniest creature, tries to save it, and thus necessarily strives to be free from the deadly coil of himsa. He will be constantly growing in self-restraint and compassion, but he can never become entirely free from outward himsa. Then again, because underlying ahimsa is the unity of all life, the error of one cannot but affect all, and hence man cannot be wholly free from himsa. So long as he continues to be a social being, he cannot but participate in the himsa that the very existence of a society involves. When 2 nations are fighting, the duty of a votary of ahimsa is to stop the war. He who is not equal to that duty, he who has no power of resisting war, he who is not qualified to resist war, may take part in war and yet wholeheartedly try to free himself, his nation, and the world from war. I had hoped to improve status and that of my people through the British Empire. Whilst in England, I was enjoying the protection of the British fleet, and taking shelter as I did under its armed might, I was directly participating in its potential violence. Therefore, if I desired to retain my connection with the empire and to live under its banner, one of 3 courses was open to me. I could declare open resistance to the war and, in accordance with the law of Satyagraha, boycott the empire until it changed its military policy. Or I could seek imprisonment by civil disobedience of such of its laws as were fit to be disobeyed. Or I could participate in the war on the side of the empire and thereby acquire the capacity and fitness for resisting the violence of war. I lacked this capacity and fitness, and I thought there was nothing for it but to serve in the war. I make no distinction from the point of view of ahimsa between combatants and non-combatants. He who volunteers to serve a band of dacoits by working as their carrier or their watchman while they are about their business or their nurse when they are wounded is as much guilty of dacoity as the dacoits themselves. In the same way, those who confine themselves to attending to the wounded in battle cannot be absolved from the guilt of war. I had argued the whole thing out to myself in this manner before I received Pollock's cable, and soon after its receipt I discussed these views with several friends and concluded that it was my duty to offer to serve in the war. Even today I see no flaw in that line of argument, nor am I sorry for my action, holding as I then did views favorable to the British connection. I knew that even then I could not carry conviction with all my friends about the correctness of my position. The question is subtle. It admits of differences of opinion, and therefore I have submitted my argument as clearly as possible to those who believe in ahimsa and who are making serious efforts to practice it in every walk of life. A devotee of truth may not do anything in deference to convention. He must always hold himself open to correction, and whenever he discovers himself to be wrong, he must confess it at all costs and atone for it.